Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us for a special Q&A session with Sam Pollard, interviewed by Shelby Stone. Thank you guys so very much. I also want to thank again IFC Films for allowing us to present MLK FBI to you guys in this very special presentation, and to our partners, Radio Kingston and Black History Month Kingston. Thank you guys for being our partner for this. Sam, I have known now for quite a few years. He's been attending the Woodstock Film Festival a number of times, and we've showed a number of his films. He is on the side. He teaches at NYU Film School, but he's a prolific director, editor, and producer, and some of his recent credits include, oh gosh, the HBO miniseries Tiger, which he executive produced and I just got to see, Mr. Soul, which he co-directed, and we shot at the Woodstock Film Festival, and Sammy Davis Jr., I've Gotta Be Me, which he directed, and we shot at the Woodstock Film Festival as well. And Shelby Stone is who's going to moderate the Q&A with Sam. She is an Emmy Award-winning producer and executive producer, and some of her many recent credits include the HBO film 40 Years a Prisoner, the HBO film Bessie, and the Showtime series The Chi. So thank you both very much for joining us. And now, for further ado, Shelby, take it away.
Thank you, Mira. Thank you both to IFC Films, who is the distributor of MLK FBI, and to the Woodstock Film Festival. It is such an honor for me to be able to have this conversation with Sam Pollard. For those of you who don't know, he is an extraordinary editor, as well as a director and a producer who has had a very long track record. I met Sam in the early days of Spike Lee's career and have been really amazed at the amount, just your level of productivity and the incredible scope of movies that you have tackled. And I'd love to ask you how Benjamin Hedin, the producer, and you came together to do MLK FBI.
Well, Ben and I had worked on a previous film titled Two Trains Running that was a look at these young men, these young white men who went down to Mississippi searching for two iconic blues legends, Son House and Skip James, in 1964, you know, the Freedom Summer. And we finished that film around 2016, and we had such a good working relationship. We were looking for a second film to work on together. And he happened to read this book about the FBI and Dr. King that was written by the historian David Garrow, and how the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover surveilled Dr. King from basically 63 up to his assassination in April 4th, 1968. And after he read the book, he gave me a call and said, I think I found our next film. So then I read the book also, and I agreed with him. And I also happened to I knew David Garrow because he had been one of our major consultants on Eyes on the Prize too, which I was a producer on. So we reached out to David. We optioned his book, then we flew out to Pittsburgh where he lives. We brought the camera crew to his house. We spent about 4 hours with him, Shelby, basically having him give us sort of all the information that he has in the book, but did it for the film, for the creation of this film. And we walked away saying that we thought we had the basic elements to tell the story. We put together a sizzle reel, we put together a proposal and a budget. And like lots of independent documentary filmmakers, we started scouring for money. And at first we got some rejections and some no's. And finally in the beginning of 2019, two companies, Field of Vision and Play Action, came along and they funded the film, which enabled Ben and I to then do the rest of our interviews in the fall of 2019 and to bring on our archival producers and our editor. And we started editing with Laura Tomaselli in late November of 2019. And we did some more shooting of these recreations that you see in the film. Right before, we shot most of that, we shot all of that material the day before New York City was closed down. So we were in Brooklyn on the stage with all these props and these actors. And I had my production designer come in and say to me emphatically that he was not coming in the next day because he was worried about COVID. And if we didn't get everything, that was too bad. and we really pushed ourselves. We did a 12-hour day, got everything in the can, and the next day the city was closed down. So then we ended editing remotely, with Laura going to her home upstate and me in New York and Ben in Brooklyn. She would send us cuts. We would send her notes. We would send her more cuts. She would send us notes. And we basically had a cut that we finally were pretty pleased with, that we sent to Toronto in late July.
That's great. I love it when, you know, you collaborate on a movie with somebody and you like them so much you want to do it again. That's
Oh yeah.
brilliant. And then, so I thought it was extraordinary. I had the pleasure of doing a movie called Boycott many years ago that covered Martin Luther King's very early, his first success, which was the bus boycott. And I learned a lot from all the books and research we did, but I learned even more from watching your amazing doc. So one of the big questions I have, and I hope you don't mind, but how did you feel about doing this particular doc, which is so focused on the FBI's desire to surveil every ounce of MLK's life, essentially to destroy him if they could, but by bringing that to light? How did you feel about doing that?
Well, you know, Shelby, I come from the world of editing narrative films, right?
Yes.
And that's one thing I came from editing all these narrative films is I'm a great believer in trying to figure out how to create drama, you know, how to create drama so you have characters who are, you know, building up to this collision course. And so for me, it was the challenge of doing what I call these parallel stories, the ascendancy of Dr. King on one level and the obsession of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI on the other level to destroy him, and really building to this, you know, moment where they're going to finally meet after Hoover called King the most notorious liar, you know, and they finally had their only meeting they ever met, that they ever had, was in Washington, D.C. in '64. And to build to that. And to me, that's what I'm always trying to do, figure out how to create drama and tension. Because, I grew up at a time when documentaries were just sort of informational. You know, they were there on NBC or CBS and they were informational. But then in the 60s, when I got into business in the 70s and I started to revisit some of the documentaries from the 60s by Penny Baker and the Maisels, what interested me about those films was that they always found engaging, complex characters that you could really get caught up with, like in Salesmen or Grey Gardens, you know. So I like that idea that in real life, you could find characters who could create a dramatic arc for you. So to me, it was like something that I just sucked my teeth into, jumping into this film. I wanted to look at King as a human being, not just as this iconic person, but as a human being who had his very complicated life. And J. Edgar Hoover, who was a man who was obsessed because he had one particular vision about how America should look, you know,
Right.
and how America should be.
I really urge everyone to see the movie. And one of the things you just said that really struck home for me was we tend to turn our heroes into angels or gods and forget that they're actually people, and people make mistakes and people aren't always perfect. And that doesn't mean that they're not fantastic or their actions aren't fantastic. It just means they're human. And
Exactly.
I think beautiful point. I think that never more have we needed to remind everybody about human frailty.
Yeah, Shelby, one of my most favorite musical heroes when I was growing and got into jazz was Charles Mingus.
Yes.
And one of the things I loved about his music was the complexity of it, how it could be tonally very romantic, you know, and melodic, then how it could be, you know, chaotic and cacophonic, you know. It could be all things. And then knowing that he had a very tortured life, that he could be an ugly human being and treat people in an ugly way. You know, you said, this guy who could be so angry, who could punch somebody in the mouth, could also create this fabulous music. That to me is a human being. That's what I like. That's what I'm interested in. Human beings who are like, you're seeing them warts and all, you know.
No, I'm so glad the timing on so many levels for this movie and a lot of what we are wrestling with in the country and in the world. It could not be a better time to land. And that leads to another question, which is, having immersed yourself in the FBI tapes and all of the activity around, the hyperactivity around focusing on civil rights and the civil rights leadership, particularly with Martin Luther King, versus what we all witnessed on the 6th in our nation's capital. And sort of what did that bring up for you to watch that?
Watching what happened last Wednesday in the nation's capital enraged me, upset me, but didn't feel like an anomaly, because in America's history, so many times, marauding groups of white people would say, I don't like the way things are, particularly in Black communities. And they would go in there and they would destroy them. I mean, let's look at the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa. You know, they felt, you know, they had a reason, they thought, because they heard that a young Black man had accosted a white woman. That was enough to be able for them to go into a community that was a flourishing, even though segregated community that had its own businesses, they were thriving, to go in there and destroy it. So the same thing happened 2 years before, in 1919, when young Black men who went over to Europe to fight in a war for, basically for freedom, to come back and then to be told, you don't fit in here, and you're trying to take something from us, and we're gonna stop you. That led to the Red Summer of 1919. So this notion of white people basically saying, if we can't have it the way we want it, we're going to destroy it, is part of Americans' DNA. You know, it's something that we need to come to a reckoning with, because, and the other thing that's fascinating too for me is that when you think about it, here back in 1960s, the FBI is pulling out all stops to surveil Dr. King 24/7, right? As Chuck Knox, the former FBI agent, says in the film, every time the FBI knew that King was going to a city, they had all hands on deck, you know, to bug his hotel rooms, to wiretap them, to pay informants to be near him and inside his organization. And then you see the FBI basically coming late to the table last week, knowing full well, you know, and I know because of social media, they knew the extent of what could happen last Wednesday. They could have been better prepared. But there's a tendency in America that when it's white people doing things that you and I see as, you know, horrific, other white people say, well, it's not going to be too bad. You know, I mean, if they had the kind of force that they had when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening in the summer,
Right.
no one would have been able to breach those Capitol steps. No one.
Nope.
You know, it speaks to, Shelby, the hypocrisy of America. The hypocrisy of America. I mean, it's so blatant that you think, man, oh man, this country, man, will they ever get it right? Will we ever get it right?
You know, I've been doing a lot of Ancestry.com, and I have to say, when I watched that, you know, turns out until the last 20 years, every Black man in my family, going back to the Civil War, fought for America, for this belief of what America was, you know. And I was stunned. I was stunned by what I saw and the complete lack of response. And then I saw your movie and I felt exactly just like, well, clearly there's everything you're saying is totally true. There's a belief that if we don't get what we want, we have every right to burn it down and take anyone with us that we feel like it because we didn't get what we want.
Exactly.
We're always asked to be polite, be patient, to wait.
That's
right. You know, it's not the right time. It's not whatever the reasons are. And the most mild expression of dislike, distaste, to point out racial injustice is, you would think that you had done something horrific to the system. And what is so beautiful about your film is that it really illustrates the difference
Yeah.
between the behavior of the KKK and multiple other white supremacist nationalist groups in the same time frame as Dr. King versus the legal, as you also point out quite brilliantly, which is the FBI and Hoover have been sort of treated in history as if what they did to the civil rights movement was anomalous. And in fact, your point is that it is not.
No, no. I mean, you know, Comey says in the film, this is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the FBI.
Right.
Now, I think that's fine that he says that, but the cynic in me says, I know there are darker chapters. There's other dark chapters in the history of the FBI, you know. But the irony that's kind of fascinating, though, when you think about it, though, is that in the last 4 years, Shelby, Donald J. Trump has so denigrated the FBI that those of us on the left says maybe the FBI isn't so bad if he thinks they're so horrible.
I tell you what's on point though.
I know.
Don't mess with Black Twitter, because Black Twitter within an hour, they were like, this is who this is, and that's who this is. And I was like, wait, so you know more than the FBI, or you're just like, they were paying attention. They didn't miss a thing.
I know.
And yeah, I would love to just talk a little bit about COINTELPRO, which is still, interestingly, something that outside of the Black community isn't really very well known, that you do such a beautiful job talking, I mean, really, truly getting into its origin and its purpose and its activities.
Well, the idea behind COINTELPRO was to monitor, you know, put into place informants to any organization that they thought were radical, which I find so fascinating. Dr. King and the SCLC, the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis, you know, people like Bobby Seale, Huey P. Newton. Anytime they thought there was an organization that was stirring up the masses, they were in there to monitor, to surveil, and have informants, you know, in those organizations to report back. I mean, and then the thing that when we found, you know, and I had always known about Ernest Withers,
Right.
and you think, well, for him, who knows how he thought about what he was doing? Was it just for him to have a payday because he wasn't making money? You know, did he really think he was being really that helpful to the FBI? But the idea that he did it, and that there was even someone in King's office who was an informant for the FBI, and that gentleman who we mentioned in the film, Shelby, lives in Atlanta.
Really?
Yeah, so Ben had said to me, we should go knock on his door and we should have a camera crew, like the old Mike Wallace 60 Minutes kind of stuff.
Right.
And that's kind of where I don't go. I don't like to go in that kind of territory. I don't like that kind of gotcha stuff. So I was reluctant. I said, really? We're going to knock on the man's door and say, we heard you were an informant, you know, you infiltrated the SCLC. So I was always a little hesitant to go that far, you know. It was just not part of my style. But he lives in Atlanta. He's alive.
Wow, that's yeah. Because COINTELPRO didn't just spy; they also deliberately engaged in the spread of misinformation within these groups to help them self-implode.
Yeah, that was the idea, to help them self-implode. I mean, that was their rationale for William Sullivan to write that letter. Right. You know, basically in the voice of a supposed Black person to say, King, we know who you are. We know all the horrible things you've done. You know what you have to do. You know, that was the rationale. And then on top of it, you know, Shelby, to send the tape to Coretta Scott King, which I remember you guys dealt with that boycott.
Yeah.
I think it was in boycott. Didn't Clark direct that film? Clark Johnson?
Yes, yeah, Clark directed it.
Yeah. So I remember that in the film, you know. So, you know, I mean, this is some low down, you know, dastardly stuff that the FBI was dealing with. But this is what they were doing, COINTELPRO. You know, right. They were there to destroy these organizations by, as to use Malcolm's phrase, by any means necessary.
And they did, God knows. We have never recovered, I think, politically. We have never had the kind of leaders we had in that very very short period of
For
time.
time. No, we haven't. We have, but the other thing too, we need to also reckon with too is that even though we had these leaders, not much of would have been accomplished without the foot soldiers.
Yes.
Without the people who would go out there and really put their lives on the line. I mean, you have to listen, you have to applaud these students who would sit in these restaurants and have milk thrown on them or food thrown on them or punched and kicked and beat and not fight back. I mean, you really do. I mean, the people who were out there in Birmingham who were being hosed and attacked by dogs, to fight for equality, I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it.
I know, but I think it's very important that we never let people forget, and that movies like the movie you made they have to keep being made until somewhere enough people understand, hey, we didn't make this up. This is the history, right?
That's right. That's to take that phrase that they used after the Holocaust, never forget. Never, you're right. You can't let people forget. You got to keep it in their face. Keep it in their face. Keep it in their face.
Yes, I think that was what, another thing that made me really smile when I saw this. And I thought of you and your producers and you guys making this. I think it's very important that, it has to be, we have to keep talking about it, because it feels like the things, my mother was from the South, and
What part?
Oh, my mother was Creole, so she was from that Texas, Louisiana Creole corridor.
Oh yeah, sure.
So she was born in San Antonio, but her father's people were from Cade, Louisiana, and New Orleans. So I still have a lot of cousins in Cade, and then my mother's mother and my mother and her sister moved to the Bay Area as part of that great migration. In their instance, my grandmother wanted her daughters to have a better education.
Yeah, they moved west, right?
Yeah, and they went up to Oakland so my mother and her sister could go to Berkeley.
Right.
So, that, and you listen to the stories, and it's like my father was from California, which had a slightly different history of segregation and discrimination, but it feels like sometimes nothing's changed. Nothing that all of my ancestors fought for at all has changed, and that is very heartbreaking.
I know. Here we are in the 21st century, and it's like, Jesus, man, has America ever learned any lessons?
I don't know. Some days I think so, and some days last week I just scratched my head and, don't know what I don't know what to say about. There's so much to say about what happened. And then one last question that I have for you, which was Dr. King's assassination. And given what you show in the movie and what we know now, years later, about the amount of surveillance, how do you imagine that assassination happened? Like, have you? Yeah.
I'm confounded.
Okay.
I'm confounded. I mean, I'm on the same page as you. How could they be surveilling this man so closely, not to be aware that there was someone out there with a rifle who wanted to shoot this man? It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, there's some file, there's some recording, there's something somewhere in the FBI files that will reveal that they were either complicit or they just decided to not do anything about it. It just doesn't make any sense. But you heard Andy Young's response when I asked him. He says he doesn't think James Earl Ray was the one who did it. So maybe Andy Young knows something that we don't know, that hopefully he's put down in some journal or someplace that'll be revealed after he leaves this earth. So maybe there'll be some insight, because it's got to come out some point that there has to be some level of complicity, or basically saying we won't see that. It just doesn't make sense to me.
And I know you asked everybody in the movie, people far smarter certainly than I am and more knowledgeable, but what do you think is in those files that are going to be declassified in 2027 or made public?
Well, this is what I would hope is in those tapes. I would hope, besides the salacious stuff with everybody who's watering at the mouth, hoping to hear,
Right.
I would hope that they didn't erase the tapes where there was dialogue between King and an Andy Young and a James Bevel and a Dorothy Cotton and a Ralph Abernathy or Wyatt T. Walker about the strategies that they were going to try to implement in those cities that they were in. What were they going to do in Birmingham? What was their strategy? What was their plan about Selma? You know, how were they going to deal with the young Turks from SNCC like Stokely, you know, who were basically coming at the movement with a different agenda? You know, what was their strategy in terms of when they were going to go to Cicero in Chicago? You know, that's what I would be curious about if they kept the tapes running when those conversations were happening. You know, that's what I would like to hear.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, you know, all that's interesting is the fact that he was human. I don't need to hear the details of
That's
how
right.
that
That's all.
humanity
Yeah,
manifests.
yeah.
Like that's not important. But I wonder, you know, if these tapes include conversations Hoover had with his underlings or directives given. That might is far more interesting to me than the details of human frailty.
I would think that probably in the FBI files, if Hoover kept tapes of his conversations with people like Sullivan and others, that would be a great revelation. I bet you there's paperwork about those conversations. That I would say that there must be paperwork on those conversations. But I don't know if Hoover he might not have been smart. He might have been too smart to record himself on tape, you know. But if he did, it would be great. I mean, it's like hearing these tapes with Lyndon Baines Johnson,
right,
talking to King, talking to Hoover, talking to this gentleman who I guess was one of his associates about how to deal with King after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. That to me that stuff is like revelatory, you know, to hear Lyndon Baines Johnson.
It's another great reason to watch this movie because I have never heard those, and they were extremely interesting. And the shift that happened as the war is being lost and Lyndon Johnson gets more and more fixated on the war and trying to sell the war and quell dissension, making him basically tell Hoover, you know, giving him a free pass to do what he needed to do.
That's right, because King had betrayed, as far as Johnson could see, King had betrayed him. I mean, you know, for Dr. King to basically at Riverside Church to give that speech, knowing full well the ramifications of doing that, the price he would pay, you know, in terms of his relationship with Johnson, the Johnson administration, it took a lot of guts. It took a lot of guts.
Yeah. And maybe a whole lot of a kind of faith that eludes most of the rest of us.
That's right. A certain level of the moral high ground that he had.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I can't say enough great things about MLK FBI, but also in case you're not a documentary junkie and you don't really know Sam's work, I really recommend going back and looking at, he's made so many great documentaries and more than several, extraordinary feature films that he's been a central part of. And it's been a joy to get, I haven't seen you in a long time, COVID, etc., but it's just been wonderful to be able to spend this little bit of time talking with you.
Good seeing you too, Shelby. It's been great. Take it easy.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Woodstock Film Festival and Mira Blaustein as well for inviting us.